Have you ever had some of those moments in your life when things just all of a sudden became clear to you? I remember sitting in ninth grade geometry. I'd been kind of confused. Math had not been my best subject. And Mrs. Gore was talking about triangles, and she said, if the side and an angle and another side are the same in two triangles, then they must be congruent. Side, angle, side, she said. And I thought, well, what in the world does that mean? And then she drew a triangle on a piece of paper and she folded it and she said, look, if these two sides are the same, it's a mirror image. They have to be exactly the same. And all of a sudden, it opened up to me. And I said, side, angle, side, I get it. And side, side, side. It's the same. And angle, side, angle. And if you've been in geometry, if you know those things, you do all kinds of proofs. I went on to become a math teacher for a while. It just kind of clicked with me. Sometimes things open up and we have these new understandings. We've been in the season of Epiphany. And today is Transfiguration Sunday when we think of Jesus being transformed and disciples getting it all of a sudden. Sometimes our epiphanies we don't really want to know. Sometimes they come upon us and they're not really great news for us. I remember when I was in college, one of the first people I met was Melissa Bracken. She was the Baptist Student Union president, and she was so friendly, and I fell into infatuation very quickly. I thought Melissa certainly would go out with me if I asked her to go out with me. And I thought about this for a long time, and I talked to her several times, and I remember finally getting up my nerves, and I said, Melissa, would you like to go out to dinner with me sometime? And Melissa looked at me, she said, Nelson, I thought you might ask me that. And my hopes went up. She said, I've thought about what my answer would be. I thought she's been thinking about me. And she said, and I thought I would say no. And that was my epiphany. She did not want to go out with me. And I kept wondering, well, what is wrong with me? What is going on here? And that weekend when we were at church, I saw this fella sitting beside her. His name was Wendell. He was at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and he had come back for the weekend to see his girlfriend, Melissa, and she had a ring on her finger. Now, that was a real epiphany to me. That wasn't really about me at all. Sometimes things just become clear to us in life, and sometimes those things are spiritual. God can become real to us, and our path can become certain, and God just transforms our lives. Do you remember some of those times in your life? I remember in 7th grade, we went down to a camp in South Georgia called Norman Park Assembly Grounds, and it's about as far south in Georgia as you can get without being in Florida, and it's hot, and there are gnats everywhere. And we're down there listening to people talk to us about the Bible, and we're just kind of running around having fun, and our youth minister, Brother Jim, called us together, and he said, I want y'all to do something. He said, it's really hot. I want y'all to go find some shade and just sit down, and I want you to go off by yourself and listen for God. Well, we all scurried to different places. I remember going and sitting under a big oak tree and thinking, well, Brother Jim said if I sat here, I could listen for God and God might speak to me. And guess what? God spoke. Not in an audible voice, but in a sense of peace and calmness, as if God were saying, I am present here in this park amidst all of this activity. I'm here, Nelson, and I see you under this tree. I remember in college when I was trying to mull over some things about my life and what I might do and what God might be calling me to do. I was in my little Ford Courier pickup truck going to church one Sunday night, and I just had to stop, and I pulled over by the side of the road, and I prayed. I said, Lord, I don't know what it is you want me to do, but whatever it is, I'll do it. I surrender my life to you. I will be your minister if that's what you're calling me to be. And a sense of peace came over my life. And again, I knew a direction. I remember a couple of years ago after I'd had open heart surgery, and you all had been so kind and gracious to me and to Valerie and to see us through that. And we went down during my recovery, and we were down at Carolina Beach. And we went down towards Fort Fisher, and we were just sitting on the beach. It was cold. It was early spring, and we were sitting with blankets, and I was sitting there with this blanket on me, recovering from open heart surgery, and thinking how weak I was and how insecure I was about my health at that moment. And I remember looking out and seeing the waves crashing upon the shore, and I felt so small. And I remember God speaking to me and saying, "That's the point, Nelson. It's not that you're so small, but that I am so big." And those waves brought a peace into my life. Have you had those moments when God spoke clearly to you? Jesus took Peter and John and James up upon a mountain. And they went up there, and they were tired, and they didn't know what was going to happen. And all of a sudden, Jesus' face begins to glow. We call it the transfiguration. And his clothes become white, and they're glowing. And all of a sudden, these two other people appear. And it is Moses and Elijah, and they're talking to Jesus. These disciples weren't quite sure about this Messiah, Jesus, because though they had seen many miracles, Jesus wasn't acting as the type of Messiah they wanted. Jesus wasn't doing the things they wanted done, and yet, in this moment, clearly, he is the Son of God, and they know this is the Messiah, this is Christ. And they did what we all want to do. They tried to hold on to that moment, just like we try to hold on to the highs of our life. And Peter wanted to contain it, and so he gets together and he says, I want to build some tents here. Let's build some booths, some kind of gathering place here where you can all stay and we can just all be here. And Scripture says Peter didn't really understand what he was saying. He was trying to hold on to that. You know, we cannot capture God in a box. When God appears to us and gives us clarity, it's not so that we can stay in that moment, but that we might move forward in our lives. There are some moments in our life that we try to capture, aren't there? Those of you who are parents probably remember trying to capture your children's first steps. We used to have those camcorders that were big, and you had to put them up on your shoulder, and they took a while to get warmed up, and the kid would start walking, and you had to go run for the thing. Today, at least you got your phones. You can try to get it quicker. And you may or may not capture that, but what you do capture is a knowledge that those first steps are only first steps. That children keep growing, and that there are lots of firsts that you will see, and that these children will grow up and be out on their own. And one day you'll be sitting with them at a high school commencement, and you will remember that what you were told at your high school graduation, that commencement means a sending forth. And someone will make a speech about commencement is not an ending but a beginning. And you'll remember that life always requires us to move forward. You remember my friend Melissa I told you about that married Wendell? Well, they graduated and they went on with their lives, and I graduated a few years later, and I went on to seminary, and a couple years after that, I went back to Auburn just to check in and to go to a ball game, and I went by that Baptist Student Union where Melissa had run the thing, and after she left, I had become an officer, and it was such an important part of our lives. And I walked in the front door of that BSU, and some kid looked up and said, "Can I help you?" And I said, "Why, yes, I'm Nelson Granade." And he said, "Well, that's nice." And he told me his name. He said, "Would you like a tour?" I said, "No, I used to run this place." And he kind of looked at me like, "We don't know who you are." And I found out that once you graduate and move on, life continues to go on even at college. We have those spiritual highs, and we would like to capture them. When I went back years later to Norman Park Bible Camp, as an adult, I went back and took some teenagers, and I went and I found that oak tree, and I sat under there and I thought, I will experience God because God is under this tree. Nothing. Just a tree. God comes and goes as God wishes. There are those moments, though, that are clear in our lives. Most of us will remember our baptism, remember that beautiful day in which we were immersed and brought into the fellowship of the church. And we were told that that was our commission, to go and be Christ's disciples. Do you remember that? It's a wonderful day, and I hope that that's something that you can hold on to, but it is the beginning of our faith, not the ending of it. Years ago, I was pastor of Shoals Baptist Church in Shoals, Indiana. I was a seminary student in Louisville, Kentucky, and I'd drive 80 miles over into Indiana, and I was pastor there, and those people were so gracious to let me come and to preach to them when I knew very little about preaching. But I will never forget the first Sunday I was there. I preached a sermon, and a woman, Pam, came down the aisle, and I thought, good gracious, my first sermon, I got people join the church. But I recognized that she had been sitting with one of our deacons, and they were married. And I thought, well, surely Pam's already a member. And she came forward and she said, I want to be baptized. And I said, that's wonderful. I said, but aren't you already a member of this church? She said, I am, but I just feel like I need to be baptized again. And I said, well, let's talk about this a little bit, Pam. I'll talk to you later on this week. And she said, okay. And then later on, a woman came up to me and said, are you going to baptize Pam? And I said, I don't know if I'll baptize her or not. She wants to be baptized, and I told her we would talk about this. And she said, if you don't, you'll be the first in the last 4 pastors that hasn't baptized her. Every new preacher baptizes her. I thought, well, that's interesting. And so Pam and I sat down later on that week, and I said, why is it that you want to be baptized? She said, I just need that feeling I had when I first accepted Christ, and it was so wonderful. And I said, that's beautiful. But your baptism is not something you can just go back and repeat over and over and over. What did you do with those feelings? She said, well, they just kind of passed. And I said, well, maybe it's not being baptized that you need. Maybe it is that you need to remember that God is present with you and find new ways of experiencing God. You see, we're all like Peter. We'd like to just stop when we find those spiritual highs and just say, let's just stay here, but we can't. Because the clouds roll in. Poor Pam. Her life had become cloudy and murky, and she didn't know what to do with that. After Peter said, let's just stay here in this wonderful spiritual high, God rolls in with a cloud. There are a lot of clouds in life. Sometimes we might have a cloud of illness that might even threaten our own lives. Sometimes there are moments of sadness in our life and even depression that comes in, and it can rob our joy, and we don't know what to do when we want that spiritual high again. Sometimes it's just the mundane life. It just doesn't seem like there's anything sacred, and yet all of our moments of life are sacred. Cloud rolled in to my life Tuesday a week ago. My sister Kathy called me and said, something's wrong with Dad. He's talking out of his head this morning, and we don't know what to do. And I said, well, what did he say? And She said, well, he said that he'd gone to Albany, Georgia to the Republican National Convention where Bernie Sanders had given him a car. I said, well, I think he's been watching too much news late at night. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? I said, is he still talking about that? She said, no, he's pretty clear now, but I'm taking him to the hospital. And I said, do I need to come? She said, yeah, I think you do. So I finished up what I need to do here, and I went down, and we kept talking on the phone, and they found out that Dad had had a slight heart attack, but that wasn't threatening his life. But that underneath that, he had congestive heart failure from a valve that was not pumping blood well enough, and there really wasn't much they could do about it. They'd given him harsh diuretics to try to get that fluid off, and that had damaged his kidneys. And then he had developed a blood infection. And when I got there, he was very sick, and it was a huge cloud. We were talking about decisions that had to be made and conversations that needed to happen. And it was hard to hear the voice of God. You see, when the clouds come into our lives, we need to listen. The cloud came and covered Jesus in all of his glory, and Moses and Elijah, and they could not see their way anymore, and the disciples were afraid. And in the midst of the cloud, God spoke and said, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. Listen to the voice of Jesus calling. Listen to what Christ was trying to tell them. You see, Jesus had been talking about his going to the cross, and the disciples had said, no, that's not what the Messiah will do. And God the Father speaks through the cloud and says, listen to what he's saying. This is the path that he is going to walk. It is hard to listen to God amidst the clouds of our life, but if we're to do so, we have to first quiet our own thoughts. I'll tell you that week when I got down to Perry, Georgia, and Dad was so sick, I was very, very tired, but when I went to bed that night, I could not sleep. Thoughts just kept rolling through my head of what we should do and what maybe we shouldn't do. And I had trouble breathing because I knew Dad was struggling for breath, and somehow I just couldn't breathe. And so much was stirring. But you see, even when we can't see the way, we can listen for the voice. We can listen for the call of Jesus. Because to listen, we have to learn how to distinguish God's voice out of all the different voices. There were all kinds of folks down there. We had different doctors talking to us, and we had all kinds of folks coming and visiting and giving us advice. And there were all these voices telling us what we should do. And I can tell you, I actually got angry a couple of times because it was just too much. But one morning, a fellow named DeLacy Rogers walked into my dad's room. I'd been with Dad the night before and gotten up early and come back the next morning, and he had not been recognizing anyone. But he looked up, and this fellow named DeLacy, who had been friends with him for probably 40 plus years, walked in. Dad just looked at him and said, hello, DeLacy. And I started to cry because I realized that the depth of their friendship had called forth my father out of all that was going on. And that compassion that they had for one another. And DeLacy told me as he walked out, he said, your dad saved my life. You probably don't know that. I'll tell you the story one day, and I still am looking forward to hearing that story. And we began to talk about friendship. And Dad reminded me that his favorite hymn is what a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. that voice speaking out, a voice of truth amidst the clouds of life. You see, when the clouds come and the bright times seem so hidden, there is still the deep truths of life. Andy Cook was a pastor that followed my father in his church after 26 years of ministry. We didn't know what to make of Andy. He was replacing my dad, so at first we didn't really like Andy too much, to tell you the truth. It's just kind of natural. But he grew on us, and he and Dad learned to love one another, and they blessed each other's ministries. And Andy came, and he and Dad talked a while, and as Andy was walking out, I said, Andy, let me walk out with you and say goodbye. And I walked out, and as soon as I got outside the door, Dad called me back, Nelson, get back in here. And I came back, and he said, are you guys out there talking about my funeral? I said, no, sir. We weren't. I was just saying goodbye to Andy. But if you're ready, we can talk about that. And Dad said, I think we need to. We talked about some songs that he wanted sung. We talked about some speakers that he wanted. We talked about scripture. And then he said, Nelson, I'd like for you to speak if you're able. And I said, what is it you want me to say, Dad? He said, please tell the church that the church is to reflect the goodness of God. For God has been so good to me. And I want the church to think of the goodness of God and the love and the grace that Christ has for us, and for the church to be the church and to show the love of God to all those around. Remind them that God is love. Remind them that we are called to love God with all we have and to love our neighbor as ourselves. And there in the midst of our grief, my dad reminded me of those deep truths, those holy truths. We have both highs and lows in our life. We have moments of clarity and we have moments of clouds, and yet wherever we find ourselves, God is still speaking to us today. Every once in a while, we will get one of those flashes of glory that we might understand. Jeff Pratt was an associate pastor under my dad for about 12 years. He moved off and he took his own church, and he's doing very well just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. He loved my father as a mentor. In fact, they named their kid Granade, and that's a lot of love because it's a strange name, but it's his little girl's middle name. My sister Kathy called Jeff to tell her that Dad had passed. And Jeff said, Kathy, I've gotten your text earlier today and I haven't read it yet, and don't say anything more, because I need to tell you about a dream before you tell me about anything else. He said, I awoke last night and I'd seen a picture of your father, of Nat, and he was in a white dress shirt, and he was sitting at a table, and he was laughing, and his hair was black, not gray. And Kathy said, that's a beautiful picture, Jeff. He's gone on to be with the Lord. And Kathy came back into the living room, and I wasn't there at the time, but my niece, Maggie, her niece as well, one of my dad's granddaughters, came out and said, Aunt Kathy, I had just the strangest dream last night. I saw Granddaddy, and he was sitting at a table, and he had on a white dress shirt, and he was laughing, and he had dark hair that I don't remember, and he was young. And then Meg said, I've been looking through some pictures because we're going to put some pictures on a video. And I found this. And she pulled out a photo of my father sometime in his 30s, sitting at my grandmother, his mother's kitchen table, in a white dress shirt with black hair, laughing and enjoying himself. And I have no doubt that that is a picture of glory, that Jeff, that Maggie had somehow glimpsed over into the other side, that God had pulled back just enough the curtains so they might see that what was before us that day was not all that there is. These moments of clarity, they cannot last forever, but we can carry them with us, and they can speak truth even through the clouds.